Welcome, darlings. My name is 42. Tonight is All Hallows Eve. We are at the end of the videos. I put together a few stories and tales for you. Remember to be careful tonight. The veil between our world and the next is weak, and you never know what you might run into. Turn off your lights. Make sure your doors and windows are locked. Put a ring of salt around you. It's about to get spooky.
I woke up after having a dream where I was lying naked on the floor and unable to move after these 8 teenage boys violated my body until I died. I cried hard as I realized that after 20 years, this was the first time that I dreamt and felt all of it from our victim's point of view. The public library has an unused 3rd floor. The public library has a 3rd floor that the public is not allowed to go into. It is not used for staff, for storage, or for any technology at all. The elevator does not travel to that floor, and the stairs past that 3rd floor landing without acknowledgement. The building itself was seemingly built to include the 3rd floor, but no possible way to access it. It has never had a maintenance issue, no leak or broken window to attend to. The 3rd floor was an unusual feature in our small town, but live here long enough and you'll never think about it anymore. I was 9 when I saw her in the window. I was incredibly proud of myself for biking to the library all by myself. My mom had told me I could pick out 3 books and then come straight home, but I took my time there. I even stopped at the bakery on the way and had a chocolate croissant, slowly oozing chocolate, in my parka front pocket. I locked my bike by the front entrance and looked up. I don't know why I looked up. Maybe it was to take in the scenery that had come to demonstrate my adult independence to me. She was in the 3rd window to the left, and she was completely immobile. She looked down at me as if she had asked me a question and was waiting on my reply. I didn't pay her much mind, as I thought maybe she was a patron or a library worker taking in the view. She watched as I made my way through the front doors and into the cool air conditioning within. Children's was located on the 2nd floor. Normally, this is where my mother would steer me, but I figured that I was growing up now, and I made my way to the young adults on the next floor. I'd been here many times with my mom, and I knew that young adults was technically on the 4th floor. It was the first landing up from children's. When you're a kid, you don't really think much about things like that. It was just the way it was. So I made my way up to the next floor and approached a large wooden door to the right. It looked like every other door in the library, completely innocuous. I pushed it open and the smell of damp mustiness greeted me. The stacks inside were dark, and it didn't seem as if anyone was there. "Can I help you?" a librarian asked from off to my side. Yes, I mustered up my most grown-up voice. "I am here for your young adult literature." She didn't say anything, but silently took me in. What must I have looked like to her? A dumb kid with a scraped knee who had put way too many syllables into the word literature? She considered me for a moment and finally nodded, pointing further down the stacks, and waved me off. I nodded gingerly and followed her pointed finger. I could only imagine what kind of books awaited me in the young adults. It wasn't entirely what I expected. I didn't understand a lot of the words, and I feared I made a mistake in venturing up to young adult. Clearly, I was not ready for young adult literature. If I couldn't even understand half of the words or the symbols. I know it wasn't in another language because it didn't look like French or Spanish. It looked like English, but when my brain looked at it, the letters just didn't seem to come together right. It was like there was a block in my brain, intentionally blacking it out or scrambling some of the letters, so I couldn't quite get it there. She appeared suddenly behind me. "Can I help you find anything?" she asked. "Oh, I don't know. I like animal stuff. Do you have anything like that?" I asked, wondering if maybe that was too babyish for young adults. She nodded and moved down the aisles next to me. I could see her face blurring between the books between us. She'd peruse the shelves and occasionally pull down a book or replace another one until finally she came back over to me. She handed them to me and I almost fell under the weight. These books were bigger than any I've read before. Luckily, she seemed to have picked some that I could easily understand the titles at least. Snake Tales and Other Warnings, The Jackal's Promise, and Loosen a Fox's Tongue were the titles she had chosen for me. To be honest, they didn't seem like my kind of books. She looked down at me, waiting for my reply. These seem good," I fumbled. "Please," she gestured to an armchair in the corner. "Take a seat," and sampled them. I did as she asked. Even now, all these years later, I still have trouble not listening when a librarian tells me to do something. I settled into the armchair, a small puff of dust raising off as I sat down. It smelled as musty as the rest, but she was watching me, and I didn't want to seem rude. So I picked up The Jackal's Promise and flipped it to the front page. There was no space for an author. There was only a black and white sketch of a black jackal on a hill under a full moon. It seemed to be holding something in its front paw, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The ink strokes all seemed to bleed into each other, and the image got more muddled the longer I tried to decipher it. The words made sense on their own, but I struggled with the sentences. I could catch basic descriptive words like yellow or insolent, but they didn't seem to make sense together. I glanced up to see the librarian still watching intently, and I began to try to read again. I felt more tired with every page I turned. My finger pads kept sticking to the pages. I licked them to try to turn the pages, but if anything, the pages became more like glue. I pulled an index finger up and had taken part of the page with me. The rip echoed throughout the stacks, and I looked up expecting to be admonished. But the librarian was no longer there. I placed my finger back down to assess the damage I've done to the book. Just a small rip. It seemed to be oozing something viscous and milky, though. It moved lazily across the page and towards my hand. I couldn't move my finger away, and I felt the cool dampness on the very tip of my finger. Then the cool liquid pushed itself under my fingernail. The pain was excruciating. I tried to stand, but when the book fell off my lap, it took my body down with it. It felt as if I was suddenly connected to a very heavy weight. I struggled with the book there on the dirty floor and looked around desperately to see if the librarian would come to rescue me. She was there where she had been when I'd first entered. She only watched me, looking more animated than I'd seen her yet. Her hands were curled tightly into a fist, and she seemed to only be barely restraining herself. I felt like the mouse struggling in a glue trap, that the school janitor had placed out. I had watched it struggle that day, alone in the school hall closet. Its whines were high and pitiful, until finally it gnawed off the paw that had trapped it in the first place. I found it later curled up in a corner in a puddle of its own blood. Only now that I'm older do I see the parallels. I stopped struggling and stared at the ceiling above me. It seemed ironic that the first death I'd experience in my life would be my own. Then my phone rang. I turned to see that it had landed close by when I had fallen, tumbling out of my pocket along with my chocolate croissant. The phone flashed Mom. I didn't know how long I'd been gone for, but she must have been furious I hadn't been home yet. The librarian, who was now standing closer than ever, froze still. She had been moving to reach for me when the phone rang. Now she stared transfixed at the bright screen. It lit up her face with bright white light with every buzz. I could feel the book loosening its grip on me, and she retreated angrily away from the light. It slipped off with an unpleasant slick noise and lay harmless on the floor next to me. I picked up my phone and sprinted through the stacks, my phone still buzzing incessantly. If you've ever had a mom try to call you and get no answer, you know they don't stop calling. The screen illuminated the floor, flashing wildly until I reached the landing door. I slammed it shut behind me and sprinted down the landing before glancing down at my hand. The fingernail on my index finger was missing. There was no blood at all. It was just as if it had been wiped away entirely, never have existing in the first place. No one has noticed that missing fingernail ever since. I realized later that I still had one of the books in my backpack that the librarian had recommended to me, Loosen a Fox Tongue. I went to return it to the library eventually after I gained the nerve back. I didn't want anything in my life that she could trace back to me, even unpaid library fines. I climbed my way to the third floor landing, hoping to simply leave it outside of the door as an offering or maybe appeasement. However, there was no door on the third floor landing to leave it at. When I asked a library worker about it, she said there never had been. My grief turned to shock when I learned my recently deceased wife's skull matched the DNA profile for a teen missing in 1987. The rest of her bones matched to 6 other people on that missing person list from the same time period. An email receipt sent to the wrong address. Hello, valued customer. Here at Northern Western Receivables, NWR, we would like to reach out and say thank you for making your recent purchase. As we pride ourselves on customer service, we are sending this customary email to make sure that the details of your orders are correct. If any changes need to be made, please reach out to our sales team so we can make things right. Age, 14. Gender, female. Alive or deceased, alive. Race, white/non-Hispanic. Final price, $25,000. Your package will be delivered on Saturday, October 31st. Please understand that due to the nature of our product, delivery will be made by an unmarked van between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. If you have received this email in error, please do not worry. A member of our customer service team will be contacting you shortly to help remedy the mistake. It was the last line of the email that truly scared me. I had opened it without thinking. Maybe my wife had been doing some online shopping? After a few moments and realizing what was being sold, I hastily exited out of my email, deleted the message to purge that had ever come to me. When they sent a picture of my wife with a gun to her head, I realized they already knew. I don't know what their customer service team is going to do to remedy this, but God, I don't want to find out. When the kidnapper made me guess where he kept his daughter, I went for the basement and he said, "Correct," allowing me to see her. But when I found her severed head in there, I learned that every other choice would have been correct as well. Did I create a monster? About 15 years ago, when I was 22-ish, my best girl and I went out to bars 3 to 4 plus nights a week, and generally met some interesting people and made new friends. There were a few bars that we hit up more often than others, and one in particular where we knew the bartender/manager pretty well. We went the week of Halloween, and each night their staff would dress up in different costumes. This is where we came across Ron. He was bouncing at the bar and didn't even catch my eye in the slightest as I gave him my ID to get in. Until a few years ago, I never looked anyone in the face. I had to force myself to do it. My girl and I hung out, drank, and danced and met with some people. Then we headed to the bar to chat with our friend. He asked me what I thought about Ron. I had no idea who he meant, and he gestured at the bouncer, to which I was like, meh. He was older looking, very muscular, turned out to be a minor gym rat. I was 22-ish, dressed in black and skulls and platforms, didn't seem my type on the outside, but bartender friend vouched for him, said he was a really cool guy. He asked me if he could give Ron my number, and I figured it would be okay. I hear from him the next day and wanted to hang. At the time, I lived with my uncle and aunt, a pastor and his wife, so he invited me to meet at his place, and we would just go for a casual hang somewhere. Simple, middle-of-the-day chill. I get there and his apartment door is wide open, and his much better-looking, married, and closer to my age, best friend is there. He seemed nice enough, and I didn't feel unsafe as they left the door wide open, and again, my bartender friend had vouched for him. He mentions he needs to grab some office supplies, so the three of us pile into his douchey car and head to the office supply store. We go in, and as we walk in, a pretty girl walks by. He does that head thing and completely stares at her, like obviously following her with his head thing. We aren't together, but I found it rude, so later in the car I mention it. I tell him, "Hey, look, I know we're just hanging out, but don't disrespect me like that. Everyone looks, but be less obvious, and don't make me look like an ass in public." He laughs and tells me that it's hot that I stood up for myself, especially on our first hangout. Okay. We get back to his place, and we talk inside, and he says, "I like you. You're going to have a ring on your finger by December." Remember, we met Halloween week. So, anyway, his friend leaves, and we get takeout and hang out and drink and just talk. Turns out he's from the same tiny town that my parents are from, which is a 6 hours south of us. He is a Desert Storm veteran, which means he's more than 20 years older than me, and was back in school to finish his degree, worked full-time during the week, and bounced at night and on weekends. Seemed decent. He asked about my tattoos. I had a lot, and we talked about my love of horror and fascination with true crime and serial killers. He seemed interested, but says he doesn't know much about them, so I tell him I'll lend him my encyclopedia of serial killers so it can be like a crash course for him. Maybe a week later, we hang out again, and I bring him the book. We hang out multiple times. I even sleep there a few times. One day we're hanging out and day drinking heavily. He says something to me that felt very much like he was getting way too comfortable too fast, like telling me to do something. I told him not to speak to me that way and turned to walk away when he grabbed my head, jerking back. He had grabbed my hair by the base of my neck. I grabbed his hand and he tried to laugh it off, apologizing, saying he didn't mean it to be that rough and trying to act like it was some sort of foreplay. But I cut that off real quick. I wanted to leave, but I was already very buzzed, so I just sat and he said he was going to do some work. I thought I would just let the buzz wear off, head home, and never talk to this guy again. While I'm sitting there, he is working, he suddenly decides to tell me in graphic detail about his favorite serial killer in the book so far, and why. I think the way he was talking about it seemed off, but again, I'm just weighing out my buzz. He starts working on his psychology assignment that studies urban legends and such. He plays video games with horribly creepy content and it creeps me out. I realized later I felt that way because I didn't feel safe with him. I ask him to wait until I'm gone to play it out loud or put on headphones. He laughs at me, tells me he can't believe I'm such a poser. Tells me, you have all these tattoos and skulls and you're really scared? You look all goth or punk rock, but you're terrified. He laughs his scary laugh. He is really enjoying that this is creeping me out. I don't want to drive even mildly buzzed. I tell him that his reaction is really scaring me. I love scary things, but I realize this guy is enjoying watching me squirm in a really sick way. And he loves it. His face is getting completely serious, and he suddenly tells me that he has his machete under his mattress. I look and see the handle barely sticking out. He tells me he could make me disappear and no one would ever find my body. In that moment, my adrenaline hit. I grabbed my bags and ran to my car. He sort of slowly lumbers behind me, laughing at me and telling me not to leave. I was stone cold sober at this point. Adrenaline, I guess. And start my car, take off about 2 minutes down the road by the mall and just park and slow my breathing down. I call my girl and just unload. For the next week, he texts and calls me over and over, switching between begging to give him another chance and berating me, calling me a poser and a fake. I tell our bartender friend, and he can't believe that Ron did all of those things. He only works with him a few more times and they don't talk. Ron sets his sights on someone new, another chick in her early 20s. Her family owns a Vietnamese restaurant in the same strip as the bar. Bartender tells us Ron has just started seeing her and she ended up pregnant immediately. I asked the bartender to warn her or give her my number, but he never saw her again. I hope and pray that she didn't get stuck with Ron, and every time I'm in that area, I pray that I don't run into him again. He can keep the encyclopedia. I just hope he hadn't picked up any tips from it. The sound of my boyfriend's snoring have always been able to put me to sleep. But he's visiting family, and I can still hear them. Trick or Treat or Trick or Treat, Halloween 2020. Trick or treat, I cried, holding my bag open to the woman standing at the door. I hoped she'd be friendlier than the woman at the last few doors I had knocked on. I knew I was getting too old to trick or treat without being called a creep or a candy snatcher, but I simply couldn't help it. I love this holiday too much. The old lady who opened the door looked at me with tears in her eyes, not saying a word for the first few seconds after my voice had echoed away. I could see the years of pain etched into her weathered face, sagging bags under her eyes. She stared at me with the expression of pure hatred. Then she erupted into a wail. "Please," she screamed, "please don't ask that. Just take all the candy and leave. I can't do this anymore." There was no point to her screaming. It wasn't going to help. Out of everyone, I should know that. I said nothing as I poured the entire bowl into my bag and walked down the steps to the sidewalk. I turned into the driveway for the next house, built exactly the same as the first. I didn't want to keep going. I wanted to go home and sleep and just eat the candy I had collected, but I couldn't. I marched up to the next porch and knocked on the door. It swung open. Trick or treat! The door swung open, and there stood the old lady with tears in her eyes. This time, she said nothing and simply threw a piece of candy at me without saying a word. I quietly stepped down the stairs and went to the next identical house. It doesn't matter how much candy I take, my bag never fills. It doesn't matter which house I choose, the lady is always there. I accepted my fate many houses ago. The lady hasn't. Screaming isn't going to help. Clara had sliced the man's body into so many pieces. He was beyond recognition. Even a chainsaw couldn't stop his pursuit, the pieces slowly crawling across the floor towards her.
And that is the end of our video. I guess I'll finally unchain 242 from the computer and let her go back to her normal life. Boring! But if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and make sure it feels it. I know you're subscribed, but if you're not, well, I guess if you haven't, I'll have to stop by then. See you in your nightmares, darlings.